Welcome to the Decolonizing Reproductive Justice panel. My name is Maria, and I am a volunteer with ARC as a member of the fundraising committee. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm located today in Halifax, Nova Scotia, on the ancestral and unceded territories of the Mi'kmaq people. As this is a virtual event and we're all over the place, we encourage you to acknowledge where you're located today in the chat if you feel inclined to do so. So today's event is put on by the Abortion Rights Coalition of Canada. ARC is the only nationwide political pro-choice group. ARC acknowledges the historical and ongoing oppressions of Indigenous peoples in Canada and respects and upholds the inherent and treaty rights of all Indigenous peoples. At ARC, we're explicitly committed to an intersectional anti-colonial approach to abortion rights, reproductive justice, and sexual health. And as part of the commitment, we respect Indigenous rights, land stewardship, and self-determination, which is especially important in light of the historical and ongoing reproductive injustices committed against Indigenous peoples in Canada. Today's event is very important to all of us. So before we get started, I'm going to go over a few housekeeping items. This session will be recorded. It's being recorded currently, and it will be posted on the Abortion Rights Coalition of Canada website, except for the Q&A at the end. That will not be recorded. We ask that you please keep yourself muted, and it's totally up to you if you want to have your cameras on or off. If you're having any tech issues, you can message AJ. I'll get AJ to give a little wave there, and they'll be able to help you with any issues you may have. There will be a 15-minute question and answer at the end of the session. So we ask that you please put your questions in the chat, and we will collect them and I will read them out when we get to that particular part of today's session. Feel free to type your questions at any point during the panel. You don't have to wait till the end. And we're going to start the panel presentation. I'm going to introduce each speaker as we go. And once they've each spoken, we're going to have a moderated Q&A, which I will moderate, followed by a 15-minute question and answer at the end for audience questions, where again, I'll read the questions out that you've placed in the chat today. So I'm going to turn over to our first speaker, Louise McKay. Louise is a Métis elder from the historic Métis community of St. Laurent, Manitoba. Professionally, Louise has been a social worker all her life. In 1978, she became a co-founder of a 24-hour youth crisis line, which remained active for over 25 years. So welcome, Louise, and go ahead.
Bonjour, miigwech. I live on Métis land that was part of the Red River. We are all descendants of the Red River settlement where I live. So I'm wanting to welcome all of you to my land where I live, which is in a historic Métis community called Saint Laurent, Manitoba, which is an hour north of the city of Winnipeg. I want to start off with this. To Mother Earth, bonjour mama. As I look outside, I see your beauty in the land that is spread before me. The sun is shining here, the wind blows gently, the earth is quiet. And deep down below, the seeds are getting ready to push up and poke their heads out so we can be nourished again by your bounty. The snow that still lies on the ground, and as it melts, provides the long drinks of water so needed by those plants. This land that I am gifted to live on, and the lands that all of us live on, was once the home of all our peoples. And it has always nourished us, provided homes for us, sheltered us from storms, held us, and provided what we needed to have a good life. We say miigwech, chekose, merci, thank you to all our ancestors who paved the way for us to be here today. I ask everyone who sits with us today to gift you with a pinch of tobacco as our way of showing our appreciations. Aho, hi, hi, miigwech. The title for today is Decolonizing Abortion. So how the heck do you decolonize abortion, right? A long time ago, when when this land was what people called wild and untamed, folks came to our shores and they wanted to change the land because what they found here wasn't suitable for them, or what they said wasn't suitable for them to live on. So they wanted to change the land, to tame it is what they said, and then in taming it, then they could live on it, right? Indigenous folks say, you know what, we live with the land. You listen to the land. It speaks to you. And for you to know what the land says, you have to listen. So that was part of colonization. And along with that came a whole bunch of, you know what, you need to do things this way, you need to do them that way, and you can't do the things the way that has been going on for a long time. My mother was a foster kid. She grew up with her aunt and her uncle, and she was taught the ways of medicine. So when something happened and they needed medicine, my mom would run to the bush and she would get what they needed, right? Well, we all know that pregnancies have been here for ever, forever. It's not nothing new, right? So when the colonizers came here, there was pregnancies already going on, right? Anyways, along the way, there were a lot of what folks called unwanted pregnancies. I listened to a presentation, but that was done by May Sinesh, who's here today with us, and you have to hear her research sometimes. It's just amazing stuff. One of the things she said was um, they impregnated the Indian woman and they impregnated the black woman. The black woman was impregnated to produce more slaves. But yet, if the Indian woman was impregnated, um, they didn't want the Indian child. They killed the Indian child, right? And yet, many of those folks talked about um, it's a sin. It's against the church to kill, to abort, to do an abortion, because to do an abortion means you are killing a fetus. You are killing a child. Well, when my mother was being taught the ways of medicine, there were what folks called unwanted pregnancies in those days. So you know what? They would send my mom to the bush, she would get what they needed, and she would come back and they would use those medicines, right? Mother Earth balances. Mother Earth gives us what we need. And those medicines came from Mother Earth, right? And they were used in those days for dealing with, working with unwanted pregnancies. And it wasn't a sin. It wasn't anything wrong. It was just life. It was just the way life was, life that was meant to be. And again, you lived in balance. So that was always, always part of our life, of our life. Our women, anyways, a long time ago, they didn't the grannies for us here, it was the grannies. You have to remember that all cultures are different, right? All nations are different, and everybody has their own belief system. So what I'm talking about today is what happened here in my community and the different things that I've learned along the way about what people call abortion. So one of the things is, as women, as humans who carry femininity, we are called life givers. Being able to give life is a gift given to us by Creator. So our bodies are built in such a way that we can become pregnant and we can give life and then we can birth. We can give birth. It is not up to us to decide whether we give birth in the human world or in spirit world. That's not our decision. And it's not for anybody to come along and to say that where birth happened is wrong. I got a teaching a long time ago by a priest, right? There was a woman who was impregnated through IVF. And in her church, they didn't want her to go there because they said what she was doing was wrong. It was against God, it was against Creator. Only God can give life, right? And so what she was doing was wrong. So by her becoming pregnant through that way, she was participating in a sin and something against the church. And they didn't want her in the church. And so when her child was born, she was a very Christian woman, and she wanted to baptize her baby and all her children that she had, but they didn't allow that to happen. I was talking with this priest one day, and the subject of IVF came up, and he said to me, "You know what?" He said, IVF is assisted by science and divine by God, by Creator. Yes, he said, Creator gives life. Science just helped it come along, just helped it come about, right? So it just ticked me off, right? That some people can come along and they can impose their way of life or their words or their beliefs on something that doesn't fit them, that doesn't suit them, that they choose, and create so many problems. I attended a conference here in Winnipeg about a year and a half ago and talked to many people from across Canada. And a woman approached me and she said, you know, I enjoyed your talk so much. She said, and I feel really good. She said, this is the first time in 30 years that I feel as good as I do about what I do. And she had been working in abortion care for 30 years. You know, she had been called a baby killer for a long time and had been shunned by so many people. And she felt bad. She didn't feel good about that, you know? And so in the conversation, one of the things I was saying was, you know what? The way I look at it, when I look at it from a balance perspective, you have to remember the medicine wheel. For those of you who don't, let me talk a little bit about the medicine wheel. In the medicine wheel, you have the four directions. You have the four colors. What that means is everybody fits. No matter what color you are of your skin, you fit. You're just part of the whole. It doesn't matter, right? Anyways, I lost my train of thought. I lost my train of thought on that one. Maybe I wasn't supposed to mention
Let's
it.
try to refresh. You were speaking medicine wheel, conference in Winnipeg. The woman who came to you saying that they loved your talk, that you helped them feel not ashamed of their work. Is this ringing any
Thank you.
bells?
Thank you, Renee. Yes, yeah. What I was wanting to say was we all fit, no matter what color, what belief, where we are in life, we all fit in this whole. And because we all fit, that means that my belief sometimes doesn't fit yours, and yours sometimes doesn't fit mine, but it doesn't mean that we don't belong as part of the whole, right? I was saying to them, you know what? Some people look at what you do and they call you a baby killer because of that. I look at what you do and I say, thank God you're there. Thank Creator you're there, right? I mean, life is life. It kicks us in the butt sometimes and it presents us with situations sometimes that are a little hard to manage with, a little hard to go forward with. We have to make decisions sometimes that are not that okay with everybody else, but you still fit in that medicine wheel. You're still part of that whole, you know? And I was saying that to that woman and I said, you know what? I'm happy that you're there. I don't see what you do as killing. To me, you're not killing anybody. You're not killing anything. There was a doctor at that conference who we had lunch with, and she said, you know what? After I do the procedure, she said, I take what those folks were calling a product of conception. I take that product of conception and I keep it for a while because she said that was a life and I speak to it. And sometimes I even name that baby or put a name to that. And I thank them and on and on. And she said, that's just what I do. And she said, I've been doing this kind of work for a long time and I'm still going to be doing it for a while. It doesn't matter what other folks say. So you know what? For those of you who do this work, miigwech, thank you. And I think as far as decolonizing goes, I think that's you and I working together, all the colors working together. I think the answer lies in moving forward and creating better balance in this world and decolonizing. I think that's part of all of us working together, thinking together, putting our ideas forward. A teaching that I always mention to people is, you know what? I found my voice a long time ago. And my elders used to say, hey, you found your voice. You got to get up there. You got to say something. You got to go to that mic. You got to put it out there. So as someone who found their voice, you have a responsibility to voice your voice, you know? And I just got a sign saying there's 1 minute left. So I just want to leave you all with that same thing. The medicine wheel includes all of us. How do we move forward as far as decolonizing that? All of us working together, voicing what we feel, what we see, making things better. Don't stop what you're doing. We all need that. Miigwech, aho.
Thank you so much, Louise. We're going to move on to our second speaker now, who's Gerri Sharpe. Gerri is the president of Powtutit Inuit Women of Canada. She was born in Yellowknife. Gerri has lived all across Canada and now calls the Northwest Territories home. She's the mother of 2 and grandmother of 3 and has been an advocate for women and children in the Northwest Territories. Gerri, I'll pass it over to you now.
Thank you for having me here today. I have a number of different things that I'd like to mention, but first and foremost, I do want to thank you for the invitation to come here today. This is a topic that's near and dear to my heart, and as is the Indigenous way, story time is how we relay our stories and share our knowledge. A number of years ago, about 20 some odd years ago, during one of the federal elections, there was an Indigenous man who was running to be member of Parliament, and he was running on behalf of the Conservatives. At the time, I was the Status of Women president for the Northwest Territories, and I took the opportunity to go and speak to all the candidates as I could. And he was very excited to speak with me because he knew who I was. He knew who I represented. And he said, first and foremost, let me tell you what a pleasure it is for me to speak with you. This government is going to help us bring us back to our Indigenous roots. We are the ones that are going to make sure that the Indigenous ways are followed. Abortions were never in our history. Abortions were never there. And abortions are not the right way to go. I let him continue on speaking. And when he was done speaking, I said, is your grandmother alive? He goes, yes. I said, you need to go and speak to her. He goes, why? I told him, well, you're a man and you're talking about women's medicine. There are things that happen within our histories that assisted women when pregnancies became too tough, or when pregnancies could not be, it was not in the best interest of the woman to have a child, or in some cases, and I don't want to say unwanted pregnancies, because within Inuit history, pregnancies were always wanted. In some cases, there was women who couldn't follow through with the pregnancy for whatever reason, whether it be her own mental health, whether it be her own well-being, whether it be her physical health. And I further told him there are medicines that are still used today that can induce abortions. Those same medicines are used to alleviate women's cramps. I told him that was a medicine that I actually used with my daughter because she suffered from a very, very painful menstrual cramps. And it was one of the very few medicines that helped her. And it's Labrador tea. Labrador tea is the only thing that would relieve my daughter's cramps. I'm not sure how much everybody knows about medicine, but when it comes to Labrador tea, when it's cooked in highly concentrated quantities, it can induce an abortion. This was knowledge that was passed down to different people and was used to terminate a pregnancy. The first speaker spoke about the church. I'm going to tell you that I was a residential school student. My mother was a residential school student. My grandfather, for a very short period of time, was also a student. This knowledge is what they wanted us to forget. This traditional knowledge is what they called evil. But they also called my tattoos evil. They called drum dancing evil. I want to tell you that when it comes to this information, how vital it is, because it was the colonial way to bring births into a hospital setting where it doesn't belong. Hospitals are for sick people, not for somebody bringing life into the world. I say this because my grandfather, who was also a midwife in the early 1950s to 60s, before he became an Anglican minister, because they chose him as a leader. I didn't know how much knowledge my grandfather had until he came over to Inuvik, where I had lived for 23 years, and my son was 4 months old. And my eyes were very sunken and very dark. I'd already had at that point probably 4 DNCs. And my grandfather asked me, "Are you sick?" And I said, "Yes. I have what they're calling retained placenta. They've tried a number of different times to remove it, but they just can't." And in my head, my train of thought,
Oh, Gerri, you've muted on us.
sorry about that.
That's okay. There you are.
So at the time I was telling my grandfather that what had happened to me, and I really didn't think that he would understand what I was talking about. I knew that he did not go to university or college. When he was of that age, he was still hunting on the land. And my mother was being taken from to go to residential school. And I was prepared to brush him off. So keep in mind that he's speaking Inuktitut to me, because he didn't speak English. And he said, "Well, when you gave birth, didn't they put the baby on your belly?" And I said, "Well, yes, of course they did." "Well, didn't you breastfeed the baby as soon as he was born?" I said, "Well, yes, of course I did." And he went on to ask me a few more questions. And I said, "Yes, I did all that." He goes, "Well, then why didn't the placenta come out?" And I said, "Well, they had to pull it. They had to pull some of it out. And when they pulled it, that's when parts remained inside." He goes, "Well, they shouldn't have done that. They should have done it this way." And at that point, I realized the level of knowledge that my grandfather had. Somebody who had been born on the land in the early 1930s and continued to deliver babies well into the 60s. So at this point, he was born in the 1920s. I realized just how much knowledge was lost when he passed, how much knowledge he was not allowed to pass on to other Inuit. Interestingly enough, Inuk means the people. Inuyunga means I am Inuk, or that is the context in which most people say it today. But it also means I am alive. I am living. And this is also the word, when you refer to a child that's just born, you say inulihaktok, just became alive or just born. And when you speak of death, inuhuertok, not living anymore, death. The literal translation, Inuk, alive, human. This is when a person is born, is when they enter the world breathing. So any child that isn't born breathing is not alive, is not part of this world, as an Inuit would say, because you need to draw breath to be alive. The tattoos that you see on my face, there were also tattoos that would be specific to a midwife or a medicine person, so that you did not have to ask where that person was. They were easily identifiable to you, and that you can go and see them in private so that others didn't have to know your business. There were also tattoos that they would put on the legs, and the legs, that is to help draw the newborn into this world so that they could draw breath. Needless to say, I'm losing my words here, I'm sorry, mortality rate where there were no hospitals was a little higher. But then at the same time, everything is meant to be as it is. And if there were children that were born that were unwanted, then they were adopted out. That's not to say that a woman has to carry through with a pregnancy, because that is the mother's choice to do that. Whether or not she wants to go through with a pregnancy is nobody else's concern except for that woman. And there were ways within the Indigenous histories to help her make those decisions. The colonial way of looking at things today is that it has to be done by a doctor, that you have to go and see a nurse, that you have to go to a hospital. This is not the Indigenous way of families. The Indigenous way of families is in the community. So when you're giving birth, you do it in your home with your family around you. If you choose to not follow through with the pregnancy, that is your choice. And you are able to seek that help without anybody else knowing. In today's world, I live in Yellowknife, and the majority of the women that live in the Kitikmeot region, as well as the Sahtu region, and the South and North Slave region here of Northwest Territories, have to come to Yellowknife to give birth. They are being removed from their families. And this is also the same for their reproductive health. If there were women that need any type of reproductive care or pre and postnatal care, they are told that they have to go to a major center. And that should not be the case. This should be readily available to all Indigenous women who need to access that type of service in their community in a way that is culturally relevant to them. We have the knowledge, we have the know-how. The colonial laws say that we must do things one way. And this is not our way of doing it. It is a way of watering down our knowledge, and we can't allow that to happen anymore. And I'm not sure how much time I have left, but I think I'm going to stop right there for now.
Thank you so much, Gerri. Appreciate that. Moving on to our final speakers, we have Dr. Renée Monchalin and Créa Ferguson. Renée is a member of the Métis Nation of Ontario. She is a mom and assistant professor in the School of Public Health and Social Policy at the University of Victoria, a Michael Smith Health Research BC Scholar, and the director of the Fireweed Project. And Créa is a mixed Indigenous undergraduate student at the University of Ottawa. In addition to working on the Fireweed Project as a research assistant, she is also currently a birth center aide at the Ottawa Birth and Wellness Center and the director of Francophone Affairs for the University of Ottawa's Indigenous Students Association. So welcome, Renée and Créa.
Thank you, Maria, for that introduction. And thank you so much, Gerri and Louise. That was an incredible way to start off these conversations and learning from both of you. And before I jump in, I'm just going to share our screen. We only have a couple slides to help Créa and I kind of stay on track. So I'll go to share screen, share, and then slideshow. Can everyone see this okay? Yeah. So amazing. So hi again, everyone. As Maria said, my name is Renée. I'm a member of the Métis Nation of Ontario, and I was born and raised in Fort Erie, Ontario on Attawandarong territory. However, my Métis family, we originally come from the community of Sault Ste. Marie, and our family members then moved east to Calumet Island in Quebec, also known as Ile-du-Grand Calumet. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Victoria, and today I'm going to be speaking a little bit about my research with my team called the Fireweed Project, but some of those original earlier research that helped inform the Fireweed Project and what we're doing today. And maybe I'll hand it over to you, Créa, first to introduce yourself, then I'll speak to a little bit about what's on the slide.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Créa. I'm currently speaking to you from Ottawa, so unceded Algonquin territory. So I am mixed Indigenous on my dad's side. I am a member of Tynega's Mohawk territory near Kingston. But my Nokomis, or his mother, is also from Wikwemikong, unceded First Nation. And on my mom's side, we are like historically mixed Black and Mi'kmaq from Nova Scotia. And we also have descendants who came up from the United States after they were enslaved. And now I work for the Fireweed Project, and it's been so much fun getting to dive into this research with Renée and the rest of the team.
Thank you, Créa. So, and also, I don't think I said where I'm calling in from. I'm calling in today from Wasanich territory, which, for those of you who might not be familiar, is on the southern tip of Vancouver Island. So thank you again for having me. Even though I said we'll be speaking a bit about fireweed today, I'm going to be talking about some of the exploratory research we did in advance of that informed Fireweed Project. And one of the quotes on the screen was actually from one of the community members we spoke to across Canada. And they said that we've been managing our own bodies without Western medicines and Western policies and rules way prior to 1492. So I wanted to kind of set the context of what Créa and I wanted to speak to in this quote, because it really kind of highlights that. And like Gerri, like Louise said, this knowledge has always been here. And our communities and our grandparents have always held these knowledges around how to prevent or end a pregnancy. And it was largely with the stigma that came with the church and these colonial religions that really made us to feel ashamed of this knowledge, and also fractured this knowledge through things such as residential schools. So I'm going to go to the next slide. So here is our core research team. So this is the folks kind of working behind the scenes of the Fireweed Project on a day-to-day basis. On the left, Astrid Perez-Pignon. In the top left, Madison Wells. In the center here, we have Shay Lynn, and on the right, Willow Paul, and on the bottom right, Créa, who is with us today and who you get to hear from. And we're doing this work in partnership with 4 community partners. One of them being Equatal Doula Collective, another Northern Reproductive Justice Network, Abortion Support Services Atlantic, as well as Northern Manitoba Abortion Support. And so I want to tell you a little bit about why we called it the Fireweed Project. And this is another quote that we're drawing on from one of the participants in our exploratory work. And they say that there's one plant called fireweed, and you can usually find it up in northern Alberta or anywhere where there's been forest fires, because it's a plant that grows and grows after forest fires. But I know that we traditionally use that as birth control, but also as a medicine to implement abortion. I kind of have a philosophy that with the knowledge of herbal methods ending a pregnancy, Indigenous culture suggests a tradition of honoring pregnant people's self-determination of their own bodies. Unfortunately, in my culture, you hear a lot of abortions never happened. We didn't do abortions. Abortions are a sin. And I think that really came from colonial Christian Catholic settler ideologies, which we've been kind of hearing about earlier in conversations today. And on the left-hand side, I wanted to recognize the logo for our project. So this is our Fireweed logo by local Wasanich artist, Sarah Jim, who did this work for us. So we're super grateful for that. And for those of you who have your cell phones on hand, please feel free to go to the QR code in the top left-hand corner. I'm like, what did I put this to? And I'm pretty sure it's to the logo info on our website. But I also want you to go browse Fireweed website. We have an incredible advisory committee, many of them who are on the call today with us, including AJ, who's facilitating this conversation. So we have many great folks guiding the Fireweed Project work and everything that we're doing. And I'm going to pass it on to Créa now for the next slide that we want to share.
Yeah, so I think I'll start out by reading the quote. So it's a quote from one of the papers that Renée did, I guess, before this, where so it says, being Haudenosaunee, I call it an old value. As a woman, one of your jobs is to have children, raise children, bear children, and then there's that old world stigma that's like, if you don't have children and have a family and raise a family, what are you doing? Traditionally, birth control, you're not supposed to do that because you're going against the Almighty Creator and trying to play God almost by controlling things. If they're going to happen, they're going to happen. So why are you trying to stop it? So I thought it was important to highlight this quote in the context of decolonizing abortion, because it's really important for decolonizing abortion to kind of set a look at what is the message that we're trying to send to these younger generations. I mean, I'm part of the younger generation, so I'm kind of including myself in that. But how do we, as I guess people who work with abortions or abortion service providers, work to kind of counter this colonial Western, I guess almost like religious narrative that our communities don't have space for abortion when we're talking about like reproductive health or other like similar reproductive health needs. And like even in the context of, you know, social media, I recently saw a video that was shared on social media that was talking about, I think it was something along the lines of, if you're Indigenous and you don't have children, what are you doing? And I think it's just, what does that mean for all of our Indigenous community members who don't want to have children or who aren't in a position to have children? And I think really like we have to recognize that kind of this whole topic of abortion access and reproductive justice has to kind of take into account all of like so many factors and so many different things that kind of impact where we are at in terms of like just, I don't know, all this knowledge that we have that's kind of been lost because it wasn't communicated and it was hidden, I guess, intergenerationally.
Thank you so much, Créa, for sharing that. And just kind of building off some of the quotes that we shared. Communities who want to access abortion, they're experiencing so many elements of stigma, not only from the social and broader systems, but also within the communities and their families themselves. And this isn't because of things such as like the church and religion, which we spoke about through the Indian Act. But it also has to do with, oh, now I'm losing a train of thought like Louise, but what was I going to say? So it doesn't even have to do with the colonial religious point, but also the fact that communities as Indigenous peoples, we're facing this ongoing genocide against our peoples, and that's through things like forced sterilization and things like that. So there's so much pressure, like Créa was mentioning in the past quote that we shared, around this pressure to conceive and to bring life into the world. And so folks who maybe it's just not the right time to have a child or don't want to, there's so much pressure. And being a Métis person, for any of the other Métis people in the room, you know that relationship is so layered with the impact and the influence of Catholicism in the European culture and our families. And I wanted to touch on a quote, and this actually builds off of what Louise was saying earlier from scholar Patrick Wolfe around the African ancestry and Indian ancestry, what he says in terms of Indian status. And Patrick Wolfe states, Any amount of African ancestry, no matter how remote and regardless of phenotypical appearance, makes a person Black. For Indians, in stark contrast, non-Indian ancestry comprise their indigeneity, producing half-breeds, a regime that persists in the form of blood quantum regulations. As opposed to enslaved peoples whose reproduction augmented their owners' wealth, Indigenous people obstructed settlers' access to land. So their increase was counterproductive. So we have this idea of this like pressure to not only conceive, but also, and Créa and I were talking in preparation for this panel on like marrying within, dating people within the nation, to date people who are also status. And there's so many layers with identity and blood quantum and land and connection to land. And it makes it challenging on like, how do we go about this as an Indigenous person? And here we are wanting to practice our rights in a time where sterilization, coercion, forced abortion, like these are all really scary and real realities. And so we'll wait till the questions after to speak a little bit about what participants in our research have shared around how we can decolonize abortion specifically. But that's a little bit of context of some of the work we're doing. Créa, is there anything you wanted to add onto that?
No, that was perfect.
Over to you, AJ, I guess.
Thank you so much, Renée and Créa, and thank you to all of our speakers. That was incredible. So we're now going to move into our moderated discussion. So we have some prepared discussion questions, and I'm going to ask them and then kind of open the floor up to our panelists to take turns speaking as they will. So our first question is, what do we know about Indigenous peoples' abortion care experiences in Canada? This can include barriers to culturally sensitive and affirming care, to outlining what Indigenous people want and need from their abortion care, to considering what reproductive knowledge and practices look like prior to colonization, and how colonization has impacted those knowledges and practices. So I'll open this up to any of our speakers, and if you need me to repeat anything, just let me know.
I can start a little bit if that helps. So you're asking kind of like, what's the context right now of Indigenous communities accessing abortion in Canada?
Yeah.
So the reality from what we've learned from folks we've been speaking to, as well as our own experiences in this research, leading this research as Indigenous women who've also accessed abortion ourselves, everything from mistreatment, coercion around decision-making from physicians, many physicians saying you might be making the worst decision of your life or trying to talk you out of it. Not only travel distance, as we all know with remote communities, but even the logistics around that. You don't really know how complicated it is to go about planning an abortion until you're in that position. And luckily, we have some incredible hotlines in Canada with Action Canada and NAF, but a lot of communities may not be aware of these services and may be nervous to go due to fear of anonymity. Also, as I spoke to earlier, the stigma piece. There's so much stigma from society and community that it almost comes into being an individual stigma of individual shame on, am I doing the right thing? Should I be doing this? And then we have the harsh realities in our country of ongoing sterilizations and forced abortions, right? So a lot of people are plain on scared on asking or accessing the healthcare system. And then we're coming back down to the pressures to reproduce, like Louise was saying earlier. And what was the last part of that question, Maria?
Yeah, absolutely. And how these knowledges and practices, what they look like prior to colonization.
Yeah, okay, thank you for refreshing my memory. And I wanted to speak to some research that I came across by Métis scholar Kim Anderson in some of her earlier work, who actually has oral evidence of, and it was Anishinaabe communities who, when settlers came over and documented some of the first contact on how the families were smaller in size than some of these settler families, as well as children were spaced out. And so it just provides evidence that this knowledge around preventing and ending a pregnancy has always been here. And it wasn't until that shame came along with the colonial groups that things began to change. I'll hand it over to anyone else who would like to build on any of this or respond.
Yeah, go ahead, Gerri.
So there's a number of different things that I'd like to touch on there. First and foremost, being from Johaven is my home community, which is in the center of the Northwest, well, then the Northwest Territories. It's now located in Nunavut. Women who used abortions when I was much younger, would be given a 3 strikes you're out. In other words, if they went for a second or third abortion, they were told literally, you have to have your tubes tied. They did not look at how those pregnancies came about. They did not look at the circumstances in and around that, or even consider why the woman was wanting an abortion. This was during a time that Inuit women, as well as Dene women, were becoming pregnant by the church. And I say the church because the priests that were expected to look after the students were the ones that were impregnating the students. So when I hear people say that it's a sin against the church to have an abortion, well, I think it's a sin for them to slaughter students and have mass graves. And how dare they think that they can even try to put their nose in somebody else's business that is not theirs. The amount of women that were forced sterilized because they had too many abortions had no business doing what they did. The church had a huge role to play when it comes to colonization, and they're not acknowledging the harms that they caused. Instead, what we're left with is this idea that the church and religion is much higher than culture. It has no place in culture. So when it comes to religion, everybody agrees that religion does not belong in politics. Well, that is the same for spirituality. A woman's body is her body to do with what she wants. The medicines were always there. And it is not up to lawmakers to dictate how a woman can treat her body. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Gerri. Do any of the other speakers want to jump in?
I just want to say to Renee, wow, do I look terrible? I just want to say, miigwech for what she said, because you reminded me of so many things with that teaching. And in my community, that's the way it was. In my community, every family had a gazillion kids. My mother had 12 pregnancies and 10 of those children lived. But they used to talk about what you just said, that a long time ago, you used to plan on when you would have children because of the times you lived in. And you planned that by what you wanted to accomplish in your life or how hard your life was. I just want to say miigwech for that. And Gerri, you too, those teachings are, yeah, my brain is going bing, 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 miigwech.
I even want to just draw on the comment in the chat from Alicia Two Bears around, and Alicia, if you want to come on and say your quote, or if you're okay if I read it out loud. I don't see you on the screen here. Oh, there you are.
I'm in my Saturday morning best, y'all. That's
Right.
I'm like, I'm assuming, is it
The one about your old rules? It just connects beautifully to what was said.
So never more than you can carry in a camp raid. So that is one thrown in the moss bag cradle board on your back and you haul it. You can't make a 7-year-old, nor do you want to make your 7, 8, 9-year-old run as fast as an adult. You're going to leave them behind. So, which also leads to other stories about twins. But so your kids now might be 13, 14 years apart, maybe having 2, which means the other portion of this is coming from people who traveled so frequently, not always having a period until winter camp came too. And so not relying also on that like as a birth control method, but the plants also to end pregnancies that you didn't want come a really long, hard winter where ours were like 6, 7, 8 months at a time. So that is another like perspective, and it also gives you the time to well develop all of your children for best community care practices, not being overwhelmed by 6 toddlers back to back to back to back. How do you can't give full love and compassion regardless of aunting and uncling and putting everybody out to raise. Your gifts are like honed from a very young age about how to best raise you so your community does best well. So that means less children overall.
Thank you, Alicia. I didn't mean to call you out on that, but I just loved
No,
your
I'm okay. I'm okay with that. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Does anyone, Renee, did you have anything else to add to that, or you?
Oh no, I'm just reading the chat. Even Janelle, the Métis families got visits from the priest asking where were the children and newborns. And it's so interesting because I wasn't going to say anything, but even with my grandmother who grew up on Calumet Island, like, yeah, family of 12, so many kids back to back to back, a Métis family. And when my grandmother was born, was expected to be carried right away the moment she came out of my great-grandmother, to be carried by her older sister right to the priest. And they're like, register her, make sure she's like documented. And then the priest not only did that, but also decided to change her name. So gave her a different name based on his like whatever mood of the day. So it's a really interesting thing, and it's even making me think about the identity right now in Canada and how it's so connected to all of this, and how we're expected to have like these colonial documents and paperwork to prove who we are. And so it's just a real interesting connection. But I'll pass it back over to you, HA, for the next few questions.
It'll be Maria who's guiding us through the questions.
Oh, thank you, Maria.
No worries. Okay, so moving on to our next question. What about Two-Spirit folks? What is Two-Spirit, and what do we know about access to abortion for Two-Spirit people? Go ahead, Gerri. Yeah.
I can't speak to abortions for those that are gender diverse, but what I can speak to is the idea of 2S LGBTQIA. A number of years ago, we were watching a Cree hoop dancer, and this was up in Inuvik, and he was explaining to people his history and that he was a twin. Interestingly enough, he says the Cree community viewed twins as a baby that had too much spirit, so therefore it would split into 2. So you have twins. And it was like a light bulb was turned on in my head. And I asked him, which he did not appreciate, so does that mean that 2SLGBTQIA is the opposite of that? He goes, but what do you mean? I said, well, if twins come from an egg that has too much spirit, therefore causing 2 spirits, does that not mean that somebody who identifies as gender diverse, does that mean that they do not have enough spirit, so there are more spirits that come together, so that you can have female male, or female male, male, so that you have somebody who is diverse identifying. He did not appreciate that comment at all, but it made complete sense, because in nature there is, if something is one way, then the opposite also applies. So this, and it made me understand 2SLGBTQIA in a much bigger light. Before I stop, though, I will also say that with Inuit, the idea being two-spirit does not apply to being human. So two-spirit refers to a human who can shed their skin to become an animal. So, or an animal become a human. When it comes to the Inuit beliefs, those that identify as gender diverse are human, and sexual activity belongs within a human. So gender did not apply. So this is the same thing with naming children. Gender does not apply. So that the name could be masculine or feminine, or it could be after somebody else, a male relative or a female relative. Gender didn't play a role. And that is the same thing when it comes to love. Gender does not play a role as long as you're consenting. Play into me.
Thank you, Gerri. Do any of the other panelists want to go ahead?
I can say a couple things to this. So in terms of two-spirit people and their experiences with accessing abortion, there's not very much available around that, but we're trying to help document these experiences and find out more. But what we do know is that because two-spirit people don't fit this colonial gender binary of having to be one or the other, they face many disparities due to discrimination in the healthcare system of not fitting in these norms, right? And not only on top of that, but one thing we do know is in Canada is Indigenous women experience violence at 3 times higher rate than non-Indigenous women. And while we don't know exact numbers, we also know that two-spirit individuals face higher violence rates because, again, they're not fitting in that gender binary. And they're more likely to experience experiences of violence and assault in all forms within and outside the healthcare system. And this is really worrisome because it shows, and what research shows is that when folks who are able to get pregnant are likely to experience violence, there's also a greater need for abortion access. And that study that the Native Women's Association of Canada did a couple years ago now, during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, they found that most Indigenous women and two-spirit people were more concerned about violence during the pandemic than the pandemic itself, and rather than the virus. So it's definitely something that needs further attention and more research, and that's what we're trying to do right now through our current research. And also it's really important to know, and this is something that we do know, is when we talk about the grandparents holding these knowledges around preventing and ending pregnancies, we often are also taught that two-spirit community members, and when we say two-spirit, that's a very simplified way of saying it as well. It's much more broader and a larger term that can encompass many things. And what we also have learned is that some communities have had up to 7 gender roles and 7 different genders. So it's important to know that it's not like one clear definition to somebody. But two-spirit people have been known to be knowledge keepers in their communities, as well as hold knowledges around medicines when it comes to preventing and ending pregnancies. And it's really amazing from my research and knowledge as well, is that two-spirit people, it's we even learn about how they are bilingual within their communities and speak not only various different languages and like the feminine and the masculine, but even in like their duties within the community, they would be very fluid. So it's really incredible and really amazing. And we have so much more work to do to bring these community members back into the circle and to hold them up and honor them in this work, because they're the ones I think that are really going to bring us forward in creating culturally safe spaces and culturally safe abortion care for all Indigenous community members. So yeah, that's all I have to say. I don't know if anyone else has a comment.
Thank you, Renee. If everyone has gone that wants to speak, we can move on to our next question. So the next question is, at ARC, while we focus on abortion, we are grounded in a reproductive justice framework, one that works to advance the right to have children, the right to not have children, and the right to parent children in safe, healthy, and sustainable communities and environments. As an intersectional framework, we're also concerned with all other attacks on the right to bodily autonomy. Can you share what reproductive justice looks like for Indigenous people, including examples of injustices from the past and present, and examples of efforts forward or toward advancing reproductive justice on Turtle Island? And I'm happy to repeat any of that if it's longer, if anyone needs. Go.
One of the things that I'll mention now is that reproductive practices should be happening in everyone's home community. You should not have to travel a day, 2 days, 3 days to receive any type of care. How Tutik advocates for midwifery services to be returned to our home communities. And this would include pre- and postnatal care, as well as any reproductive care that is required by a woman. Currently, and I'm not sure how many people are aware of this, women in the Northwest Territories and Nunavut, in the smaller communities, I shouldn't say smaller communities, in the NWT, I believe there are 4 facilities where they can do childbirth. Otherwise, you have to travel to a community up to 4 weeks prior to your due date to wait in that community to give birth. Up until about 4 years ago, you were expected to do that on your own. So if your spouse or anybody else is coming with you, they would have to pay for their ticket, which means that if you have any other family, they were required to stay at home. If your escort who was coming with you had a job, they were expected to leave that job. This is still the case today. There is no reason why this should be mandatory, other than the fact that it is law. This is not how things are supposed to be. So this is one of the injustices. As I mentioned earlier, when it came to abortions, they would count the number of abortions that a woman would have. And if she had more than 2, she was automatically required to have her tubes tied without even, it shouldn't have to be justified. If a woman wants an abortion, she should have an abortion. This is not something that should be justified or for the world to know about. As it currently stands, if one of the communities, a woman wants to come and have an abortion, she first needs to tell the nurse. The nurse then tells the visiting doctor. The visiting doctor then fills out the paperwork that goes to medical travel. Medical travel then has to approve that. Then it goes in a great big circle. So you now have probably 20 people that are involved that shouldn't even be involved and know why you have to go on medical travel. There are services that can be provided in the community that would make it safer for Indigenous women. By default, by removing anybody from their community, you put them at risk. Now, when we look at the numbers for MMIWG, the majority of the women that have gone missing or are murdered are in the southern lands. Not all of them, of course, but this is because we ourselves have placed our women at risk. by making them go south for either childbirth, employment, education, or even any type of treatment. And they get stuck there because they're removed from their community, their support system, their resources, all for the sake of law. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Gerri. That was extremely informative. Does anyone else have anything they'd like to add?
I mean, I can speak a little bit. I think what I've really noticed is that we've come to a place where I guess past few, like historically, all these policies have kind of removed community from like reproductive health. And I think we need to move back towards getting that community. How can we as a community work together to give this support to everybody? I think both from like policies like Gerri mentioned, also policies related to like children's aid societies and the removal of children. And I think that even trickles down to like, you know, if your children have been removed and then you all of a sudden you're with child again, and you don't have support, well then how are you supposed to like move forward? There's so many steps, there's so many things. And I think that's where different like models of care and even things like I mean, I'm more well versed in the midwifery model of care working at the birth center, but where I guess having like this safe space to not only I guess celebrate but also process all the emotions that can come with anything like regarding reproductive health, because you know they can be both positive and negative emotions, and I think it's being able to be in a place where you can like I guess be empowered to kind of make these decisions and have all of these feelings and I don't know, move forward. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, thank you. That was wonderful.
I just want to say miigwech for all your comments. And you know, I do a lot of work at the Women's Health Clinic in Winnipeg, and many years ago, our politicians here were working hard at convincing the government to have a birth center outside of the hospital. And because at that time, the only birth center there was within a hospital. And like Gerri said, that, you know, that doesn't belong in a hospital. Anyways, they were successful with their work, and the province here agreed that there would be a birth center outside of our hospitals, and that's how the Women's Health Clinic not the Women's Health Clinic, but that's how our birth center at the Women's Health Clinic came into existence. At the time, it was decided that it would work according to an Indigenous model. And so the folks that were there, they, you know, talked to an elder and they said they wanted a spirit name for this new birth center. And, you know, the elders got together, they had a ceremony, and they came up with a spirit name. And then they approached the board of directors and they gave the spirit name. And the board of directors said no. They would not accept the spirit name. And so this birth center that was started, it was supposed to work according to an Indigenous model with an Indigenous name. When the board of directors said no, that birth center operated as a birth center, but it was never able to fulfill its mandate the way it was birth, because in its birth, it was supposed to be according to an Indigenous model, and it didn't work out that way. So sometimes we get into our own way, right? Sometimes, for whatever reason, we make decisions that make the good work that we want to do, the good work that we're doing, not happen in the way it should happen. And so since then, I became part of the staff at the Women's Health Clinic, and in part of all of that, what we did was we went back and we now have a spirit name, and it's called Odaman, meaning where new life comes from. The strawberries where the new life comes from, and that's the teaching of the strawberry. Anyway, so now we have the name. Now we're working at achieving and fulfilling the mandate of that, what our birth brought about. And the other part of that is when you consider that we also have an abortion care program that became part of the women's health clinic 15, 16 years ago now, or 10 years ago, I think. It as well, when it first became part of our clinic, it as well didn't work as well as it should work. Today, we the with the staff we have and the program that we have, and the funding that comes to us, we're able to do only so many abortions, but yet we can do many more abortions. So every now and then we take a hit from government and from our funding bodies that say, well, how come you're not, how come you don't have as many births as you're capable of? How come there's not enough abortions? How come you can't do all the abortions that come to you? Sometimes yes, government doesn't provide enough funding. We can't find funding in the places that we, but sometimes people get in the way and make decisions that should not happen. That should not have happened 14, 15 years ago, but it did. Miigwech.
Thank you, Louise. And thank you to all our panelists for answering these questions and this wonderful conversation. We are now going to move in
Maria.
Oh, yes.
Can I just say one last thing? Do we have like 2 minutes?
Absolutely. Go ahead. Yes.
Okay, I wanted to build on everything that Gerri, Créa, and Louise was speaking to in terms of this concept of midwifery and like bringing birth back to communities and giving communities like more self-determined rights, especially when we're talking about these forced evacuations. And the thing is, like right now, we're talking about bringing birth back to communities, and actually NACM, so now the National Council of Indigenous Midwives, is doing a lot of this amazing work with bringing birth back to communities and giving back the birth and full spectrum birthing support through midwives, the aunties and the grandparents and two-spirit community members. And what this means though is that through this, so like obviously midwives and doulas, like they hold this knowledge, right, around birth and supporting communities and bringing birth back to their communities. And we need supports from government and policy to further provide care, or sorry, support systems to midwives and doulas to perform this work within communities, but also giving midwives and doulas more supports around ending pregnancies and giving them more rights around that, because they know the knowledge, they have the knowledge, right? But it's interesting because this idea of midwifery and bringing back birth to communities, it really roots back with my European ancestors. And because back in Europe, midwives were referred to as witches, right? And this fear came over to Turtle Island, and then birth workers, Indigenous community medicine knowledge holders were called that they were doing the devil's work, right? And so this shame is now coming through all these practices, or like this stigma around birth in the community. And I think we really need to make changes through policy, right, to help tackle this stigma and provide midwives and doulas with actual support. So we're not only bringing birth home to community, but we're also providing supports within communities to prevent and end pregnancies, as well as tackling some of those stigma pieces. And some like people are starting to do this, right? And I really would like to acknowledge 7th-generation midwives in Toronto for really leading a lot of this incredible work around reproductive and sexual health. And I just wanted to make a quick note before I finish. Many participants in our research speak to the importance of acknowledging abortion as we would acknowledge, say, a miscarriage in community, and how our participants spoke to how, yes, we may be making this choice and how we need this abortion to happen, but we also should be supported through this. And Gerri was speaking about this earlier about having community, right? And so folks in our research spoke to wanting to have these supports of community, of traditional knowledge keepers, of the medicines in the abortion access space, and how that even though you made this choice, it doesn't mean that someone isn't experiencing complex emotions around what loss may look like or something like that. So anyways, that's my final 2 cents. I'll end it there because I know you're on a schedule.
No, thank you so much, Renée. We are going to end our recording now, and we're going to move into our audience questions. And since we have a large group, again, just a reminder, if you want to stay muted and put your question in the chat, if you have one as they come along, that would be great. So our first question